I'm Caroline.
And I'm Sid.
And we're tapping in. Welcome to our podcast, Teens Tap In, where we tackle and destigmatize various mental health topics with guests relevant to the discussion.
Now, to get to know us and your guests better, we're going to do 5 fast, quick-fire questions. Starting off, I'm going to ask Caroline, what is your secret hobby or talent?
I am really good at knitting and crocheting. What about you, Sid?
I can write backwards with my left hand when I write forwards with my right hand. It's kind of confusing, but it works.
Okay, Sid, if you had to go undercover and create a new life, where would you go?
Definitely out of the United States, probably to Greece or Italy, somewhere it's warm all the time. Where would you go?
I think I'd go probably to the South America, live in the jungle. I don't know. I think that'd be fun.
That's cool. Okay, number 3. What is your favorite book?
This past summer I read Where the Crawdads Sing, and I really, really liked that book. What about you?
I don't know. I don't really have a favorite book, but if I had to choose, I'd probably say The Jungle by Upton Sinclair.
Okay. What is something that you're currently worried about?
I'm currently stressing a little bit about our PASC state conference that's in November. Doing a lot of work for that, and it's making me a little stressed out. What is something that you are currently worried about?
Sending in college applications.
Very fair.
Who's your favorite band or artist?
Okay, last one. Mine is Harry Styles, and who is yours?
Definitely Frank Ocean.
Very good.
Now we're going to take a quick break and cut to our generous sponsor, St. Clair Health, for an ad.
At St. Clair Health, we're always improving, building on our commitment to face the challenges of today, making an impact on the communities we serve, so we can be stronger together. St. Clair Health, expert care from people who care.
Hi, welcome to our first episode of Teens Tap In. We have our first 2 guests here, Mr. DiNardo and Mr. Hathey, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Hathey.
My name is Mike Hathey. I've been lucky enough to be on the outreach board for a few years now. I've taught at Mount Lebanon High School. This is my 18th year. I grew up in Mount Lebanon. I have 2 kids in Mount Lebanon. So I'm just very, very, very lucky to be so involved in the community.
And I'm Pete DiNardo. I'm a supporter, but not on the board of outreach. I've taught in Mount Lebanon for this is my 25th year. 32 years overall. I've lived in the community for 18 years. My kids have graduated from the system. I teach in the social studies department and am involved in a lot of community activities, and I'm pumped to be here.
All right, now we're going to go in with our Fast 5. Sid and I have already answered these, but we're going to let you guys go ahead and start off with, do you have any secret hobbies or talents, Mr. Hathey?
I think I don't have any secret talents because if I'm good at anything, I make sure everyone possible knows it. That being said, that's a short list, so not really.
Only the ability to prank my high school students.
Okay, fair. Yeah.
I'll do number 2. If you had to go undercover and create a new life, where would you go and why?
Montana, just because I think me living in the middle of the woods wouldn't really set off any alarms for anyone.
Very fair.
You've got a good point there, Mike. I wouldn't question you being in the middle of the woods at all, in a lone cabin.
That's
barren.
Sort of what I'm envisioning.
Right. I think I would hide in New York City.
Okay.
It's an easy place to hide.
Right.
Okay. What is your favorite book?
I'll take this one first, let you think. It's a small book from the early 70s, Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach. It is a book that will take out loud an hour to read, and I've read it to audiences dozens of times.
I think the book, there's a bunch of books I love. The book I've read the most is Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. Just opens your eyes to seeing things in a very different way.
Okay, number 4. What is something you are currently worried about?
The price of higher education.
That's a good one. So are we.
2 seniors here.
The survival of our democracy.
Okay. Okay, number 5. Who is your favorite band or musician?
Just like my kids, I don't pick favorites.
Uh-huh.
At your age, it was The Clash. So I'll just leave it at
I
that.
know who that
Me
is.
neither. I was just going to pretend like I did.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to say that in high school, it would have been Nine Inch Nails.
Oh, two very exciting names.
Yes.
And now our first annual sponsor, St. Clair Health, is going to tap in.
At St. Clair Health, we're always improving, building on our commitment to face the challenges of today, making an impact on the communities we serve so we can be stronger together by creating reliable resources that recognize all of our neighbors with access to the highest quality healthcare, advanced care close to home, and a shared humanity that delivers on our joint vision to create a healthier community for all. St. Clair Health, expert care from people who care.
Okay, so on our first episode of Teaching and Learning Through COVID-19, we have Sid and I, two high schoolers, and Mr. Happy and Mr. Renardo, two high school teachers. So four very experienced people on the topic. So to kind of get our discussion going, we're going to ask a very broad question of our two guests. What was the hardest part of having to teach through a screen?
I think before COVID, I thought I knew how important nonverbal communication was. And I had greatly underestimated just, how much information is conveyed from one person to another by the way they're looking, where they're looking, little size and things like that I didn't even realize I would pick up on in a classroom. And that really would direct me and saying, well, we need to take more time with this topic. We're ready to move on from this topic. Having to just decide most of the time on my own when it was the appropriate time to sort of move forward in a lesson was really difficult.
I'd concur. The ability to read body language in the classroom helps a lot. But not only from the student up, but my own energy and body language. And I usually am a mobile teacher, but that was very difficult. And you can use physical proximity to get a kid's attention versus 25 squares on your laptop screen.
Yeah, I think from the other side of that, I mean, it's definitely hard to not be able to engage, have side conversations, whether it's with a teacher or with another student that are, mostly relevant. And when you're not having that kind of face-to-face interaction, it definitely it's not as engaging when you're just listening to a lecture. I mean, at no fault of the teacher, if no one's engaging, then it kind of loses that importance.
Even just like the group work aspect of it. I mean, like getting like glances, who are you going to work with? I mean, I always glance across the room. I'm going to work with this person and this person before the teacher even says, pick your groups, or I'm assigning groups, or anything like that. I mean, anything like that was just like taken away. And it's really hard to deal with that when you can't give those little glances, or you look around on Zoom and you see faces, but the faces aren't actually seeing you. You know what I mean?
Breakout rooms were brutal.
It's really hard. When you can see people, but you know that they're not looking at you, or they're not even looking.
When you get put in a room with like two other black squares, and like no one's even awake. I mean, it definitely tested my peer-to-peer patience.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. I think there's so much respect and rapport that's built in a classroom just from little side conversations. We always talk about it in when we're working in lab. Like, scientists don't just sit there and do science. They do science, and then they talk about their family, and they talk about their dog, and they talk about where they like to eat. And the inability of students to work in that sort of environment, I think, really set back how quickly classes would gel. Mm-hmm. In the classroom, it's within a few weeks. People know each other. People know what to expect. I think it took much, much longer last year, just because you're looking at a bunch of screens. Even if you're not looking at a black screen, you're looking at screens. There's not that physical proximity, and I think that really took away from it.
Do you think you see that in like younger grades, that they're just not meshing as well, or not like conforming, not necessarily conforming, but just not getting the social aspect and not like the people to people skills that they might need to be successful?
I actually found this year my sophomores were the most willing to engage in discussion the earliest, because I think they were, and I was worried going in. I was like, they were either going to be very complacent with the way everything, they were going to be mad that they weren't in their pajamas all day, or they were just going to be starved for interaction. And I found that it was absolutely, they wanted to just talk to somebody about school and, be with other people and have those meaningful conversations. So I was very worried about that, but I did not find that to be the case this year.
Good. Okay, next question we have, how did you make an effort to connect with students even when they were not there in person?
I think that it's got to be done creatively, and one of the ways certainly is one-on-one Zoom conversations. I mean, it's still virtual, but voluntary, because if you mandate it, it's a task and a chore, but offering it and then kids pick that up. We had a number of them that in that first iteration, when we went to school at home for the 2 or so months afterwards, there were 2 groups of kids, Lucas and Kara, that would stop by my homeroom every day, and they would be late for first period. They'd leave homeroom. So we had a couple of times where we stopped during that period. Half a dozen kids had lunch in my homeroom. We had the lunch bunch, and we just scheduled twice during that time period to have lunch, even though we're not connected to each other. But I think the best way in that time period, the best way I think that connecting with them, I had a senior homeroom, and it was a disaster for them because they had nothing, everything that would be planned as those benchmark moments were lost. And I decided that we'd have one thing that wasn't going to be delayed, and that was going to be the senior reception. So I made an arrangement with Graham's. They, this is early on, so you're worried about, everybody was still worried about everything. And they put 3 cookies in paper bags, and I had those bags. I'm like a hazmat suit, picking them up, putting them in giant eagle bags. And to my homeroom and my gov class, there was about 30 families that wanted to get involved. I hung them on their front door, and that night we had an hour-long Zoom senior reception in which we did something on the night, evening it should have happened, and in its closest to normalcy as we could in that period.
Yeah. And I don't know, that word gets thrown around so much, like normalcy, like how normal could it have been? And I think striving to make it as normal as possible was so important.
Yeah, I had a couple teachers that would do because it was, March through the end of, I guess what would have been the 1920 school year.
2020. I understand what you mean.
2019-2020 school year. We didn't have any classes really. That was the most backwards couple months of my life, really. But teachers that did take those extra steps and did make an effort to reach out and meet and set up Google Meets, when no one even knew what a Google Meet was. That stuff was definitely not lost on the people that participated in it. I was stuck with my family for 24 hours a day, and I just craved connection with anyone. So that stuff really did make a big difference.
Extra efforts were definitely appreciated. When teachers would go out of their way to even just stay on the Zoom the extra 7 minutes between classes, so you could ask them a question or just talk to them like you would in the hallway when your next class is right next door. That was meaningful. It was very meaningful when they would just stay on instead of turning their camera off and leaving and walking away. And I know it was really hard for them sometimes because they also needed a break, because it's hard to stare and sit on your screen for 7 hours at a time, 8 hours at a time. But when the kids are doing the same thing, it's really meaningful when they would stay on and have a real discussion after they've gone through their entire lecture.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I know you have great relationships with kids. How did you continue it?
So I think it's funny. Breakout rooms, I think, are a sort of a double-edged sword, where I found them incredibly helpful, mostly just because people aren't going to talk in a Zoom meeting in front of 25 people. But lots of people are willing to talk in front of 3 or 4 people. So I did them I mean, what I pitched was like, this is going to be more like a lab. You're going to be able to collaborate, which was helpful. But I think I would go into Zooms and, no one's talking. I'm like, just tell each other what you had for breakfast. Just talk about what you're, I mean, stuff that has nothing to do with science. And especially I think in that whenever we were remote in the middle of the winter, when it was dark outside all day, I think that was just talk to people about anything.
Yeah.
I think was really, important. But that was the biggest thing is I would just go into breakout rooms and just chat, just talk to people about whatever it was that they were willing to talk about.
Yeah.
And Sid, your point, I think that was true. A lot of people would stay or arrive early.
Yeah.
And that was great to be able to just have the conversation with, folks that, they're your age. And it was nice to have the little bit of conversation. What I found too was that when you mentioned, Caroline, those black screens. So there were kids. I had the most failures ever in my career during the semester. I only taught one semester, but it was rich. And what you found was kids that were outreach would be interested in, kids that were really swirling down, and the difficulty in keeping track of all those kids. But even reaching out, because they often were the kids that entered class, but then were somewhere else in their house. But to reach out with emails, I'm sure you sent hundreds of emails to kids and parents. You had kids who really even appreciated that. They're like, it's not you, it's me. Yeah. And those were rich conversations to have just for 40 minutes. And parents appreciated that, even if their kids still didn't perform academically. But those are some pretty cool things that kids I'd never met, because I was teaching from my basement, unlike Mike, you just wish that there could have been a different context to meet this person.
Okay, so our next question is kind of playing off of what we just talked about with, black screen. So you always hear everyone saying, in situations like this, you kind of have to choose your battles. So are there any battles that you felt like you had to give up on, like the students turning their cameras on, like getting students to participate in discussion, even kids getting their work done? I mean, at what point did you have to value your own, kind of sanity above being a stickler for the kids that wouldn't participate like they normally would?
I think so. As far as cameras being on, I said from the start, there are times when it will greatly behoove the class for you to have your camera on. I will tell you when that is. I would really appreciate it if your camera's on. The rest of the time, it's not as big a deal, right? And I think just being able to say, for this 15 minutes of this day, it's really important. For this 25 minutes of this day, and there were entire days where I was like, you can keep your camera off because we're just going to be going through this. I'm going to be lecturing. It's not as big a deal. I think that's a thing. I think the other thing that came up as far as participating in discussion, I realized very early I would never expect everyone. I mean, in a normal class, in a normal year, not everyone is comfortable sharing questions and answers in a bio class in front of all their peers. Mm-hmm. There are just people that aren't. There are people that are going to ask 50 questions a day and answer 50 questions, but that's not everyone. So I think, again, I just utilized small group discussions and one-on-one discussions. And I might say to a kid, hey, I haven't heard from you. If you're willing to come in for 5 minutes to just talk about where you are. And they're like, well, thank you so much for not making me talk. Because it is, I mean, even in a classroom, you maybe have, if you're lucky, 50% that are really, really engaged in the discussion as far as participating in the discussion. I think you might have everybody engaged, but I didn't want to expect anything participation-wise that I wouldn't have expected in a normal classroom.
And on that issue, I was torn because I fully understand the diversity of we have a modest amount of economic diversity, and certain kids wouldn't have the desire to show where they're at or whatever it may be. Certain kids certainly just didn't want to be seen on screen. But I also was reading and talked to some of our psych teachers, the importance of even virtually seeing each other. So you're talking about the idea of everybody at a black screen. So I was really weighing those two, and I would cajole. I said, "Hey, just give me some loving," and usually that would turn on 5, 6 cameras. But then I also had to understand it was a junior who said to me, "Mr. Donardo, you need to stop worrying about it because there are more cameras on in this class than in any other class I'm in." So I tracked it, wanted to see, because parents were saying no cameras on. I had 40% of cameras on in U.S. history and nearly 80% in Gov.
Yeah.
And so when certain people said that no cameras are on, that might be the case for certain classes, but 40% is not too bad. And on certain moments, I'd say, this is a serious conversation. Can we, as many as we can, turn these on? But I didn't release it being anything personal or, anything large, and you just sort of put that away.
And I did follow the pattern in my AP and honors classes. It was cameras were on, and it was cameras were on in my AP classes almost 100% of the time. I know in A-Push they were on the whole time. Even when he was screen sharing, even when he was lecturing, almost everyone had their camera on. Whereas in my academic class, there were only 15 kids in it, and I think I was one of 2 people who had their camera on maybe 50% of the time. And it's really hard, I know, for teachers to teach to empty faces. But when you are lecturing and you are sharing a screen and not looking at the faces, that would be easier. And I know Mr. Manette, he would tell us, like you did, Mr. Hathey, for this 15 minutes of this day, I need you to have your cameras on because we are going to be having a discussion, and it is easier to talk to people rather than talking to screens. But I did notice that trend that in my higher and harder classes, a lot more kids had their cameras on than in my academic classes, where maybe it was too difficult to put their cameras on. Maybe kids weren't as comfortable putting their cameras on or weren't as confident in their answers putting their cameras on, but it did follow that trend.
Mr. Nari, you said it's not personal, but I almost have to disagree with you. As much as there were the individual cases of a kid, that didn't even have a camera, I think it really made a difference in who my teacher was, whether I was going to turn my camera on or not. If the teacher was actively engaging me, I'd turn my camera on and, in a sense, reward them for putting a good class together. And I had one teacher last year that every morning, she was my first period class, which made it double tough, but she would, at the beginning of class, sit there for sometimes 10 minutes until every kid had their camera on. Mm-hmm. And that just made me more resistant to turning my camera on, because then I had to sit through her frankly boring class and listen to her lecture for 45 minutes about, and it's 8 a.m. and I'm at home. When a teacher was being a stickler about their camera, that's when I started to not want to turn it on. And I think, when a teacher was engaging me, I felt like I wanted to engage them. So I think it really counted, how the teacher was teaching, whether or not I was going to, give them that engagement.
I agree. I was the same way. I think we had the same teacher. Actually, I don't know if it was the same teacher, but...
Should we say her name?
No. But it was difficult when people would sit there and take away from the lesson, waiting, not even for cameras, just waiting for a response from someone who you knew wasn't in the room, or taking away from class, waiting for just anything of that nature. Someone who you knew was not going to give an answer or not going to turn their camera on, they would wait for upwards of 5 minutes, taking away from class time, where if you're taking an AP class, that is time that I'm going to start doing work for another class at that point. I'm going to start going on my phone. If I'm at home, you've lost my attention. The class is gone at that point. I'm not paying attention anymore, especially in that class.
Did you guys find, because I'm not a technologically savvy person, did you feel that teachers use technology well to engage you?
Not particularly.
Yeah, I don't think I can blame that on the teacher because, the situation was as new to you guys as it was to us. And I do think some teachers, definitely the younger ones did, doing things like Kahoots and, was it Nearpods and,
Nearpods were very
Ed puzzles, stuff like that was definitely, interactive lessons was definitely engaging. But there's only so much you can, again, do through a screen that I think it wasn't an ideal situation for everyone. It gave me a new respect for the kids that do cyber school.
Yeah, I've put it on my to-do list to learn all 3 of those, and for 2 years now I've not done any of it.
Well, you should get to work
It was very difficult, and Kahoots do get old because we've been doing them since about 6th grade. But I do really appreciate the effort that you could tell some teachers are putting in a lot more than others to at least try to familiarize themselves. Like you said, you've been at least trying to get familiar with some different topics and some different platforms that you might not have been introduced to before the pandemic. And you could tell which teachers were trying and which teachers were just cutting and pasting their slides, putting them in a PowerPoint, and sharing their screen. And that was their entire lesson. And you cannot involve an entire class by doing that for 45 minutes. You will not get their attention. It's just not going to work when you're lecturing for 45 minutes with shared PowerPoints and no cameras. It's not going to work. You can go to the next. Is that your question or my question? Oh, it's my question.
Yes.
Okay. Next question is a little bit of a turn, but how did you take care of yourself throughout the pandemic as a teacher and even now?
So for me, this one's an easy one. The unexpected joy of pandemic was a ton more time with the most important person in my life, my wife. I'm a workaholic, and it's something that I've been working on. But in that spring session, when we were at school at home, every day at 4:00, we took a walk together. Typically, I don't get home until 6:15 or 6:30. This year, I've made it 5:30. But then during the rest of the first formal part of 2021 year, we had lunch every day, a big salad, and we would do a crossword puzzle together. And we're continuing that at I leave school now at 5:30, and we do it at 5:30 as we sit down to have our meal together. So I think I went on sabbatical after the first semester, and it was really frightening because for 18 months, we've been together for 33 years. In 18 months, we haven't had that connection together. And I thought, this is going to suck. We've been intentional about trying to keep some of that alive.
I mean, I spend as much time away from any technology as I possibly can. I have 2 little kids and a wife that will at least humor me and go on hikes and go fishing and do all those sorts of things. So we just spend time away. It's funny how well my kids get along when there's nothing that sort of gets in between them. I mean, even if you're not going on the world's toughest hike, you're not going up up the side of a mountain. I mean, there is a teamwork aspect, making sure you can all cross over a stream and those sorts of things. I feel like that was great for them to get away. There was no, when's the next class? When am I, for elementary, they were last year, they were in 2nd and 3rd grade. So I think it was as much for them as it was for me, but just to be outside, away from technology, not worrying about, okay, I have 6 more minutes before I have this next class. Yeah. To just have a completely unstructured days. I mean, we went to Ohio Pile 30 times just to go down there and hike and, fall in the river and those sorts of things. I think that was the biggest thing, was just to completely disconnect from all the technology.
Yeah, you're right. And yet there's one area of technology that I did, two things I did also. One, I kick caffeine generally. I'll have a little coffee here and there, but I still have decaf coffee because, it's just a social moment there. But in the summer after we shut down, I started to use Headspace and have gone 458 days straight with I get up at,
Congratulations.
yeah. And so on my phone, I'm using that, but for an effort to have 16 to 20 minutes a day to meditate in the morning just before I stretch. And then exercise. So I think it's all important there. I think you two have pointed out that I'm getting old. At some point, you pointed that out in class.
They should have if they didn't.
Yeah, right.
No, I would never.
Thanks, Val.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Val.
So kind of building on what we were just talking about, of what aspects you of that self-care that you've kept going, like your meditation, your hikes. Is there anything that you did differently in the teaching sphere of things that you're, kind of carrying into this year as we return to what a normal classroom looked like pre-pandemic?
I am almost completely paperless. Right? I've always joked that like trees aren't infinite, and as such, we shouldn't be handing anything out that we can't, that doesn't allow some interaction. So I give out structured notes that people can follow along with and jot things down, because I think some people are just still much more comfortable taking notes on like a paper format. That's it. The labs are online. I've actually found one of the reasons that I've done this as well is I always give little bits of feedback on stuff. Last year, I got the most responses to feedback that I've ever gotten. I mean, by far. And I think it's just there's a comment on this assignment, a message gets sent to the student, and I think they're just more willing to look at that if they can just flip through it on their phone than they would be to read the piece of paper. I mean, a lot of the time, you look at the grade at the top of the paper, you put it away.
Yeah, or in the recycling bin.
Or you put it exactly.
I actually am continuing something, but it was the idea of less is more. I reduced workload in both classes a lot, reduced the scope of what I cover.
So we're being the reduced.
Oh yeah, yes you are. So I think that's been one of the key ones I've done that I'd say that will continue.
Yeah. And do you find both of those things effective? As you I know it's still early in the year, but as you're going, do you see a change at all?
I certainly, in this way. Not, I never had busy work in anything, but it's also okay to know that kids are going to get a fine product and have a little less. I mean, just when I'm saying that you haven't had homework that much, and that's what I'm saying.
I think from the student side of that, I'm definitely more engaged in classes that I'm not doing the busy work outside of school for. I mean, for one, I kind of lose respect for a teacher when I have to go home and, write down a vocabulary definition for 30 words that I look up in the textbook. And I mean, also when I'm not getting burnt out on a class outside of school, I'm more willing to engage with the content inside the classroom.
Mm-hmm. You're giving 100% inside the classroom. It's easy to go home and give 0.
Yeah.
Rather than split it.
There's one other thing that I did that in U.S. that I continue to do in U.S. and that is I read a number of newspapers, and one of them is the Washington Post electronically. New York Times still in paper because I got to have that tactile sense at some point.
You can give it to me. We'll compost it.
All right. I recycle it. Yeah. But the Washington Post has a weekly column called The Optimist. And so on Fridays, I spend the last 10 minutes telling kids stories, whether it's from that or not, about The Optimist. And I've had many kids say that, like on a Friday that we might not be able to do that, they're like, wait, we don't get the stories of, possibility and joy and that there's hope in the world, because I did it because of the situation we were in last year.
Yeah.
And then I thought, this is working really nicely. And it's all just, it's funny because I think of myself, I was hired as a content specialist, but I think of myself successful because of relationships I've built with kids. And so what I'm doing is reducing the content to continue building those relationships with kids. So.
I like that a lot. Next question. How did you make an effort to understand what your students were experiencing last year? That's a hard one, I know. I
think the easiest way to do it was to just come out and be honest and say, like, I can't imagine. Like, I didn't go through, and I think it was interesting 2 springs ago when students were saying, like, well, what was this like the last time it happened? I'm like, I mean, like 1918? So I think just me coming out and saying, I don't know how hard this is for you. You have to let me know. And like, just being honest and saying, this is, I just assumed much tougher for someone who didn't have life experience to draw on for any of this. And just, then kids were much more willing to just say, like, well, this is really tough and this is really tough and this is really tough. And I've 2 little kids, and I would just say, like, what do you miss about, like, what did you miss that you did last year that you didn't do this year? just to get as much of a perspective on it as I could.
I know Mr. Minette said one thing that made me so sad. It was when I think his daughter or his son's birthday, and they sang on Zoom. And it was like a 30-second song, and his son or his daughter turned around and he was like, "That's it," and just went back to class. And I mean, for an elementary school student, it's like heartbreaking. How do you go through that as like a, I don't know, 6 to 10-year-old? I mean, experiencing that from like 3 years prior to just going on Zoom, because they're still learning. They have no idea what that means, and that just made me sad. It was awful to like hear that story and just think about that, just like feeling of not being content after getting a little song for your birthday.
Yeah. You know, one thing that I would do, and I've noticed it especially with my juniors, I use just a Google form and they like to see the aggregate responses, and then they don't feel like they have to say this. So they see out of the 100 kids, this many kids said this. So I did that in that school at home. We just addressed COVID, and there's surveys about that. I archived it with the Historical Society because in some years that'll be used. And kids could give me their name or they could not. And so, you have multiple choice things, but then also free response. And but you would get then the aggregate view at least, and then kids could tell you things. And I think, those things, voluntary meet and greets, trying to just hear what's going on.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, so kind of on the other side of that, what is something, or what do you wish your students would have understood about, obviously you guys had to pivot just as much as us. What do you wish your students had understood about your experiences in the last, I guess, 18 months now?
I looked at that question this afternoon, and I'm not sure they need to. I don't know if there's anything that it was a tough time finding something. I think each of us responded very differently, but during that 2 weeks where everything shut down, there's no doubt that throughout from that point until the end of the first semester last year, I've never worked harder. I think they got that. But during those 2 weeks, I was just trying to learn I learned Zoom pretty quickly, and then they told us we couldn't use Zoom. That was a bummer. But I don't know. I don't think I need them to. I was struggling to really come up with something that would be profound, and I don't have anything on that one.
Yeah.
I think the biggest, and I think that students started to understand as we went through that we didn't have any more information than anyone else did. Because I had they're like, so when are we going back? And I'm like, you will get an email when I get an email.
Yeah.
And I think that there was sort of a camaraderie and like, well, I'm going to teach you from my basement or my classroom. If you're there, if you're not there. So however that looks, that's what we're going to do day to day. And I sort of took it that way. But I think that, there was sort of like, well, next week, I'll see you. I'm not sure what the format's going to be. I'm not sure where you're going to be. I'm not sure where I'm going to be, but there'll be class.
Yeah.
I think they also got it. I think now that we're thinking about this, that my basement became a classroom quite literally. Mm-hmm. I brought home my podium. It's a big, heavy thing. We found a beautiful, you put up a 4 foot by 6 foot, it was a whiteboard on my wall there. You can put it up and write it at that point. I brought home to the sides of that were some of the quotes on the backboard there, so kids always saw that. Then when I was sitting at my desk, John Lewis behind me, Mary Beth Tinker behind me, and my sort of radical thoughts above there. I had to give it as much for myself to be feeling that I was in something close to what we normally do rather than just in a chair.
That makes sense.
So this hasn't been the most optimistic conversation, but our last question for you is, in what moments do you feel that you or one of your students or one of your classes really shine despite the circumstances?
I still believe, and I said this to Dr. Davis and others, that 5% of kids did better remotely. And I think we have to figure a way how to address that. In that first school at home, I had kids on the spectrum that would never feel comfortable with other kids in the room. And what they wrote was out of this world profound. And just thank you for showing me what you have. I think I have one student this year who on the info sheet that they fill out said the last point, how are you feeling about this year? I want to be home. And then this person came to the meet and greet and said that this person is just, they are much more comfortable at home. The kids involved in activities, but it was very clear. The squirrel video, I'll remember that forever. This was an awesome video. You got to watch it. It's a guy in his backyard, little fenced in backyard, and he sets up this whole obstacle course for the squirrels.
Oh, is it Mark Rober?
Yes.
I love that video.
That is awesome. I kept showing it to everybody. So things came, wonderful things that kids did to make it human and to just make my year.
I think, in considering this question, I remember, I think it was like into April that I realized no one had given up. And so I don't think it was that specific moment, but it wasn't, I don't remember that being, there was no like impetus for me saying, oh my God, this was amazing. But I just thanked all the kids and they're like, well, what else would we do? And I'm like, but I don't know if they were just like used to the grind of we could be remote tomorrow. We might not be remote tomorrow. And I had, performances in class that were incredible. We still did all the work that we would normally do in honors bio. We wrote full lab reports and full essays. And, I said, this is amazing that you just continue to come to school and do the work. And the response was like, well, what else would we do? And I'm like, I don't know, but you're not doing the other thing. You're going to school and doing the work. And I think that was just tremendous. I got emails after the year. And last year was not the most exciting bio class I've ever taught in my life. But just like, thank you for like saying hi to me each day. And thank you for that. I'm like, you don't have any idea. Like they saved us, or me in particular, just by coming to class and engaging and doing all that they could when I knew it was, the world was what it was last year. And I think that for me, it wasn't one thing, but it was just the culmination of all the work that people put in and continued to put in, that I was just like, you're just still here. I'm like, yeah, we are. Yeah. That was amazing to me.
And one last thing, obviously the kids that were seniors last year experienced this and they're off to the next phase of life. But I've told dozens of people this, and it kind of hints at what Mike said about his sophomores in the first part of that. But I have about 160 kids total, including my homeroom. And I have never experienced in 32 years, every 6 periods of teaching and 1 period of homeroom, when the bell rings, I would say that over half of the students as they exit say thank you. I've always had like 1 or 2 kids say it, and it's incredibly awkward. You're welcome.
Yeah, I'm like, I told you about trees again. So you're welcome.
But I don't know if it's just these groups of, it's freshman, junior, senior, or if just the sense of everybody's appreciative. And I keep saying, I think it'll wear off, but it really is something pretty cool. And it has made it, I told this to a handful of people, probably the best start to a school year of my 32 years. And there's been a lot of great years. So, masks and all.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it feels like the other side of this craziness. I think the most important thing to do is acknowledge that it was hard. It was crazy hard for everyone. I don't think anyone would have asked for that to happen and for that disruption for us, were, supposed to be the funnest and also the most like formative years of our lives, to be totally flipped upside down. But I think there were some really cool, moments of humanity, just, people showing up for each other. Even outside of school, you'd see the videos of in cities like New York, where at 7 o'clock shift change, people would stand on their balconies and clap for the healthcare workers. I think those were the moments that kept me going.
And on Mr. DiNardo's note, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for joining us today. I think that's all we have for you, but seriously, thank you. Our first guest, that was very, very fun, and we really appreciate you guys coming. It was a great discussion.
So much.
Well, thank you. It's an honor.
You're very welcome.
Yeah.
The views and opinions expressed in the Teens Tap In podcast represent the opinions of the hosts and their guests. The views and opinions expressed by Outreach Teen and Family Services employees, donors, and volunteers are their own and do not necessarily reflect the view of Outreach Teen and Family Services or the show's sponsors. The content here should not be taken as counseling advice. The content here is for informational purposes only, and because each person is unique, please consult your mental health provider or physician for any mental health counseling or other medical questions. The podcast should not be used in any legal capacity whatsoever, including, but not limited to, establishing a standard of care in a legal sense, or as a basis for expert witness testimony. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast. If you find any error in any of the content of the podcast, please contact us at podcasts@outreachteen.org. Outreach Teen and Family Services, its sponsors, donors, and partners expressly disclaim any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages whatsoever arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use this podcast or the information presented in this podcast. Please go to www.outreachteen.org to see the complete notice and disclaimer for the podcast episodes.